Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome everybody to this second part of the EMN conversation series. I'm very glad and happy to welcome all of you today after we had a very successful first try in this challenging Corona times. I'm very glad and happy that we have been able to win Dr. Amina Easat-Daas today to speak about countering Islamophobia in Europe. She is an academic fellow and lecturer in politics in the School of Business and Law of the Montfort University in Leicester in the United Kingdom. She is born and brought up in the United Kingdom, but also French-speaking, which is something quite seldom in the United Kingdom. So she is now working on a book about Muslim women's political participation in France and Belgium. And I am happy to welcome her for today's talk. The European Muslim Network is a think tank that gathers European Muslim intellectuals and activists throughout Europe, aiming at fostering communication, views, and expert analysis on the key issues related to the Muslim presence in Germany. The European Muslim Network is designed to provide a space of encounter and discussion for Muslims and non-Muslim organizations, NGOs, stakeholder groups, and policymakers to produce practical recommendations for action of common concern in a multi-constituency approach. And we aim, being a vocal and creative, to play our part to challenge present and change the future of Europe. We have as a second speaker Ayub Kostic from Belgrade, a member of the leadership of the European Muslim Network and a specialist in Balkan affairs, but also following the current developments of the Muslim presence in Europe. And so maybe I will start by asking Dr. Amina about how she's looking into the rise of Islamophobia in the various parts of Europe, and whether she feels like there is a specific area that is more than another one. And maybe we could start elaborating about the current situation.
Hi, thank you for the question, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here with the EMN today. So in response to your question regarding Islamophobia and how I study this, so I'm involved in the study of Islamophobia at numerous levels. Particularly, I've written on gendered Islamophobia, so the ways in which Islamophobia affects women on the continent. Largely, you'll find, if you were to look at the statistical data, that Muslim women are disproportionately targeted by Islamophobic attacks. And those that are targeted are more likely to be targeted if they're visibly Muslim, for example, if they're wearing hijab or niqab, for example. So this is an area that I tend to study in more detail and depth. So the things that give rise to women being targeted and the ways in which they are targeted. That's not to say there's not a hierarchy of Islamophobia and Islamophobic action. It's unfortunately incredibly widespread and present across various domains and fields within our society. So if we're to look at media, if we're to look at the profiling of individuals, for example, men are more directly targeted. If we were to look at the denial of employment, the denial of accommodation and housing, you'll see that the effects are quite widespread. So that's one of the aspects in which I look at. In terms of cases, I tend to look quite heavily at France and Belgium, which unfortunately provide a wealth of information and a wealth of cases and detailed incidents of Islamophobia. I regularly write for the European Islamophobia report, which has been funded by the EU and led by CEST. And within that, I look at the nature of Islamophobia in Belgium on an annual basis, and that has been going since 2015. Unfortunately, in Belgium and across the board, Islamophobia appears to be deteriorating. Attacks and events are growing, and generally the Muslim presence, unfortunately, is one that is increasingly otherized and demonized across the continent.
Maybe Ayub, if we have an Eastern European perspective to the issue.
Listen, I would, first of all, I have also the questions to Dr. Amina, and then after I can join with my reflections afterwards a little bit with Balkans, because I'm very interested in the last project, let's say, what Dr. Amina was doing, and that is a Counter-Islamophobia Kit that she was doing for 2 years, and that was supported by European Commission. Afterwards, we will come. White is for me a very important project from the Balkans, from the perspective of the Balkans. And the book that you edited with Professor Salman Said and Ian Law, you gave the 10 counter narratives, let's say, of the, or let's say, strategies of counter narratives to Islamophobia. So, can you first of all tell us the more about the whole project more generally, and also about the goals and its outcomes? And then I will come and ask you about the countries that you covered in the project, which is very interesting, I think, for the rest of the Europe.
Of course. So the project was led by the University of Leeds, but it involved partners from across Europe. In fact, we studied 8 different cases in Europe. That was the UK, France, Belgium, Germany, Czech Republic, Hungary, Greece, and Portugal. So quite a diverse spread in terms of the more typically studied Western European cases, typically studied in terms of the nature and incidence of Islamophobia. And then we also looked at the sort of Southern Mediterranean countries, and we looked at the Eastern European countries. The interesting thing that we garnered was we began by looking at the nature of Islamophobia. That was the first phase of the project. What we really learned here was that there were different narratives at play in terms of framing Muslimness, that the ultimate end point with each of these narratives of otherness, of alterity of Muslims that came about, there tended to be common themes. So for example, if we take the case of Greece, a lot of its Islamophobia was defined by 2 primary factors. So for example, the migrant crisis, or the so-called migrant crisis, where we saw the influx of particularly Syrians fleeing Syria during the violence that had erupted there. But also Islamophobia in Greece was defined and shaped by historical Turkophobia. So you had these 2 competing factors that ultimately gave rise to the same sorts of final narratives about Muslimness that we see in cases like France, Germany, Belgium, or the UK, whereby Muslims were often seen as constituting threat. Muslimness was seen as constituting demographic threat, i.e. Muslims were hyperfertile and sought to take over, primarily through hyperfertility, but secondly, Muslims sought to take over, it was deemed that Muslims sought to take over via conversion, so forced conversion of individuals. If we look at that idea, that perpetuates across numerous society. If we think of the kind of turn of the post-colonial turn in the Asian subcontinent, for example, there were a lot of stories around forced conversion taking place. So it's old narratives that are essentially being recycled and reimagined in the contemporary frame. In addition to narratives of demographic threat, Muslims were also seen as inherently violent, inherently barbaric. Something I find quite useful in terms of explaining where we're at in terms of the presumed or alleged violence of Muslims. I tend to look at Edward Said's theories in his book 1979, The Orientalism, whereby he charts history and the ways in which colonial powers looked at Muslimness. Muslim males were typically framed as violent other, and therefore they needed to be quashed. At the same time, within that framing of violence and kind of working in conjunction with that narrative, you have the narrative of Muslim women as being oppressed. And this is something that I focus on quite heavily. Muslim women are typically framed as oppressed, forced to do certain things. So forced to cover, forced to stay at home and not go to work, forced not to drive, for example. And in actual fact, a lot of the research I do and the narratives that I try to promote through my work will see that it's actually the contrary. Muslim women are, in fact, very much active and involved agents of society. Along the narratives of sexuality and feminism, so Muslims are seen as anti-feminist, but also Muslims are seen as unable to accept facets of modern day society, and violently so. Secondary to all of that, in addition to the narratives of threat, we have excuse me, we have narratives that Muslims are here to take over. Muslims are here to threaten the moral code of Western society. So Muslims are seen as unable to interact or deal with new ways of being in Western society, i.e. secularism, for example, and therefore Muslims are here to instill their own value system. And this value system is placed at odds with Western European values. And Western European values become sort of a hegemonic value set across the continent and arguably globally. And an argued way that Muslims are allegedly trying to introduce their own values, we'll always hear the discussions around Sharia law. Muslims want to instill their own legal system. And time again, we'll hear narratives of how there are sort of in the UK, there are alleged Muslim only areas, no-go zones for other members of societies. But also it comes back to that narrative around feminism and Muslim feminism, that women are only having Islamic marriages and therefore they're forced to do so, and they have no legal right and recourse within the given host society. So all in all, Muslims are framed as other, they're framed as wanting to take over, incompatible with the West, incompatible with civilization and civility. In many ways that echoes what I would argue to be a flawed hypothesis, but Huntington's hypothesis of the clash of civilizations. So Huntington purported that Muslims, that sort of the new struggles in society would be moral and value-based, and that this clash would come against Muslimness rather than being physical land-based struggles. This, I feel, only paves the way for increased othering of Muslims. And we have this historical view that Muslims are so incredibly different to Western society. But in actual fact, if you were to study Muslims and the nature of Muslim engagement with everyday society and everyday life, you'll find that it's quite the contrary, and that Muslim values are very much in line with and compatible with European values. So this was really the first stage of the project and what we looked to do. In the second stage of the project at the University of Leeds, we sought to interview a range of field actors as to the best ways, the best practices for countering Islamophobia. So we interviewed politicians, lawmakers, journalists, grassroots activists, key players within, key stakeholders within society, to really understand and analyze what was going on in terms of countering Islamophobia. What were people doing about Islamophobia within society? Excuse me. So in response to this, we found some more perhaps expected outcomes around legal recourse, and you'll find that across the continent there are numerous groups and organizations. So if I think about the Counter-Islamophobia Collective in France, and it's sort of similar organization in Belgium, you had the idea around supporting individuals. In that regard, we had narratives around building inclusive nations, challenging ideas of exclusivity and discriminatory national projects. We also had the suggestion that we must tackle structural racism within societies, and this was about understanding the broader family of racisms that exist. And part of that was highlighting cultural compatibility and conviviality between the different ethnic groups. In this regard, one of my colleagues involved in the project interviewed partners in the Salam Shalom initiative, which exists across the continent, but it highlights the way in which Muslim and Jewish women come together to celebrate their faith differences, but also have interfaith networking, interfaith working for the collective good. And I think that this was perhaps particularly important given a lot of the narratives that persist around Muslimness, that Muslims are inherently anti-Semitic. In many ways, I think that I would argue that's quite problematic because it absolves Europe of its own history of anti-Semitism. And nonetheless, anti-Semitism is something that we must all collectively fight against in the same way we would fight against Islamophobia. So it's part of that family of racism that we must sort of continue to battle against. Continuing on the theme, we had the idea that Muslim plurality needed to be stressed. So often when we think about the sort of dominant narratives of Islamophobia, you'll find that Muslims are defined as a monolith. So they're all inherently violent. All Muslim women are subjugated and oppressed. Their value systems are entirely incompatible with the West. There was the idea that we perhaps might want to highlight and underline the diverseness of Muslims in and of themselves. So for example, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, diversity in different values and beliefs, passions, things that we're involved in, our work, for example. Along the theme of gendered Islamophobia and the view that Muslims were inherently sexist, we had the idea that challenging the narrative of Muslim sexism would be incredibly important. So in France, for example, one of my colleagues surveyed Lalab in France, or we talked about Islamic feminism. And of course, colleagues involved in the Yemen are crucial so Malika Hamidi, for example, as a crucial player in elaborating what the narrative of Islamic feminism actually is. And I think in highlighting and elaborating Muslim feminism, we start to see those diverse voices of Muslim women coming forward. And therefore, we begin to counter some of the narratives that exist around Muslim women. Building inclusive futures. So important in that regard was the idea that we needed to have collective future building as part of the broader project, but also Muslim education about Muslimness and also education of Muslims. And I think here in this regard, the Belgian or the French bans on hijab in the classroom are quite significant, and they constitute threats to the building of Muslim futures. Decolonizing the state was another key initiative that we recommended ought to be pursued. And then finally, coming on to something that I'm currently working on was the idea of Muslim verism. So Muslims creating their own representation, their own narratives. And a way in which I've become involved in this is the idea of creatively countering Islamophobia. I'm sure I'll talk about that a little further, but perhaps we can move beyond playing into sort of stereotypical narratives or becoming involved in a sort of perhaps fruitless Twitter war with an individual, but create a new narrative of what we are and what it means to be a Muslim in Europe or a Muslim anywhere around the globe.
Dr. Amina, if we look into Europe in general, then we know that 28 countries have 28 different state-religion relations. And there is a huge variety when it comes to the structure of the respective countries in relation to their religious communities. And this includes, in the end, also the Muslim community. If you look into the differences that we can see within the European countries, The UK sometimes is looked at as a role model, while because, for example, when we speak about the right to wear hijab, you have judges who are wearing hijab, you have police women wearing hijab, you have university professors, mashallah, wearing hijab. This is impossible to think of in the French-speaking regions, for example. When you look into Germany, when you look into Eastern Europe, you can see that there is a huge variety of dealing with these issues. But at the very same time, it seems as there is a common denominator around racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism when it comes to the described challenges from your side, migration, when it comes to other things, where you feel as if all these differences are wiped away. So the issue that I would like you to elaborate a bit more on is when we speak about the value, the set of values that Europe in the end has established. Do you feel that there is a shift when it comes to these values as long as Muslims are involved? You have mentioned the issue of the European history and the Muslim heritage. You know, in Germany, for example, they used to speak about the Jewish Christian European heritage. And Jews usually are very upset when it is portrayed like that, because they say, what heritage is this? Is this the heritage of the Holocaust? This maybe is part of this heritage. So when we look about into this issue of the different values, sets of values, the shifts that are happening when it comes to Islam and Muslims, how do you look into this, and how do you see the different kind of forms that you can see in the different European countries?
Sorry, struggling to unmute my mic there. There's two things that I'd want to say, perhaps three, in response to that question. So on the question of European values, one of the things that strikes me in terms of European values is European values claim to foster or adopt a sense of sort of civic duty, a sense of our civilization. And part of our civilization is that we don't demonize key players within society, or any member of society for that matter. If we claim to be European and we claim to subscribe to those values, then quite simply, we don't tolerate racism. And whether that's anti-Semitism, Afrophobia, Romophobia, or Islamophobia, or the diverse discriminations that exist, that is part of who we are if we claim to be European, whether we're Muslim Europeans or Jewish Europeans, atheist Europeans, agnostic Europeans. We are part of this society that claims to espouse these values. So let's stand up and let's take those steps. In terms of the differences between states, of course, there are key differences in terms of legislation and the accommodation of religious diversity, religious plurality within societies. And I think they're very much historically rooted. So, for example, if we take the UK, we have the history of the sort of the split from the Catholic Church, the formation of the Church of England. There had to be a space for religious pluralism, even if that meant historically at the same time, there was the enemy of the Catholic Church in the UK. But there has been that space within the British mindset that we have some degree of religious plurality. Taking the case of Belgium, for example, Belgium has the official recognition of key religious groups. So as part of that, Islam has been recognized in Belgium since 1974 by the then king. But simultaneous to all of that, we have the globalization of Islamophobia. And this is something that supersedes national constitutions, that supersedes normative values within a national context, that supersedes the law, the legislative framework within a given country. And I think an interesting way of looking at all of this, I find, is France and Belgium. So neighboring countries, Belgium is almost always, especially if you were to talk to people further out of Europe, it's almost sucked into Europe or into France or the Netherlands, but it has its own history, it has its own legislative framework, and it has its own normative values. And part of that is accepting Islam, as I said. But, and particularly within the French-speaking region, so Wallonie, Bologna and the Brussels capital region, we see almost like there's a leakage, perhaps through the linguistic channels, but also some degree of shared history there. But we see a leakage of ideas around laïcité. Laïcité in itself has evolved from the 1905, so that's secularism in French. It has evolved from the French initial interpretation in 1905, which was around the separation of church and state. We've now seen, and there's a great deal of work in the academic literature to say that it has become largely an anti-Muslim tool within French society. In Belgium, where secularism isn't strictly enshrined within the legislative framework, we see discussions around laïcité. Laïcité isn't a thing in the French-speaking regions of Belgium. Strictly speaking, it is not something. For example, if we want to take a more concrete example, in 2013 in Verviers, in Wallonia, the local council, the MPs in the local council, etc., put into place the new sort of framework for the area. Part of that framework was a ban on the signes ostentatoires, so ostentatious signs, ostentatious religious symbols. That is the exact wording that is taken from the 2004 law in France, the Loi Stasi. But there isn't the basis for it in France. So in Belgium, for example, so we're seeing this sort of leakage through different channels. But unfortunately, it's not restricted to the Francophone European world. It is becoming more and more widespread. So for example, if we take the niqab ban, it began in France. The year later, 2010, 2011, Belgium followed suit, but it spread. So there are parts of Germany, there are parts of the Netherlands, Austria, for example. It's something that is becoming normalized. So hostility and religious discrimination is becoming normalized in spite of frameworks to protect against that, normative practices to protect against all of that. You mentioned about the third point I wanted to make, you mentioned about the shared history and the Judeo-Christian tag that's always applied to Europe. And I think that there's a great deal of work being done to recognize partly the golden age of Islamic science, that we have a role to play and that we have a history. Spain was largely Muslim for a significant period of its time. That's part of Europe. We need to acknowledge, but also celebrate that and celebrate what that has given Europe. One of the institutions that I'm involved with is the Milton Keynes Islamic Arts and Culture Organization. And they recently put together an exhibition at Bletchley Park. So a bit of a background, Bletchley Park is a place in Milton Keynes that has a rich history. And it was the site from which the Alan Turing and his colleagues cracked the code. And it led to arguably the saving of a lot of lives across Europe. But Alan Turing's mathematical principles, according to the MKIAC, were founded on Islamic thought, Islamic mathematical principles. So this was part of the history that led to this moment in time, where you then have the machines that Turing and his colleagues designed were the basis of the computer that we're all so reliant on. But this wouldn't have happened without this trajectory. So the organization that I'm involved with, the Milton Keynes Islamic Arts and Culture Organization, put together an exhibition called Code Breakers, celebrating this space, celebrating the history, but it was also a very visual, very community involved project. So lights were cast up onto the building, the Bletchley Park Manor House building, but you had Islamic calligraphy, Islamic verses projected onto the building. And it was saying that Muslims, also Muslim heritage, has a role within this so-called Judeo-Christian past of Europe.
Okay, I don't know whether
I would like just to ask something, Dr. Amina, because you, Ibrahim, mentioned in the beginning of because I'm coming from the Balkans. I'm interested because in the same research that we are talking now, and in this book, Countering Islamophobia, that you have done, you also done the research on Czech Republic and Hungary, which are Central European countries, as well the Southern European countries like Greece and Portugal. So I'm interested now, do you see some kind of differences between the manifestation of Islamophobia in the, let's say, these Western countries of Europe, and these Central European countries, which are much more based, and these countries are, or let's say their national identities are much more based on this ethnic national identity than in this civic identity. So I'm interested. Have you did you detect some differences between the manifestations of Islamophobia, or let's say the types of Islamophobia that we have in the Western Europe, and in the countries like, for example, Greece, Hungary, Poland, for example, today, and so on?
Thank you for your question. So in terms of the more Central European nations, one of the key findings that emerged out of that, there were definitely different bases on which Islamophobia worked in those societies. So the Czech Republic, for example, strikes me that there was a case within the Czech Republic of Tomio Okamura, who's a far-right mayor, but actually of Japanese heritage himself, and was spouting a lot of Islamophobic racism. The Islamophobic racism that he was spouting and sharing across the country and gaining popularity for existed in a society where the Muslim population is incredibly small, maximum 2%, depending on the statistical data that you analyze. So the key thing that really came out of all of that was, even in the absence of a history, a colonial history, or a history of migration, or a significant Muslim presence within the country, you still have Islamophobia. And the Islamophobia that presents itself is not entirely different to the Islamophobia that we see in Western Europe. So really, I would say that Islamophobia, A, happens in the absence of Muslims, but B, it underlines the fact that it's a globalizing phenomenon. And if we wanted to look at the globalizing nature of Islamophobia more keenly, I think the cases of places like India, where you have the Hindutva nationalist politics coming to the fore, which is at the expense of Indian Muslimness. Or you have cases like China, where the Uyghur are being interned in concentration camps. They are forced labor, where they're being allegedly forced sterilization. So it does. I think the site from which Islamophobia is occurring has almost become less relevant, and we're seeing this kind of international narrative around what Muslims are and how they should be treated, and this can happen without Muslims, and that's the incredibly worrying thing.
We have some comments also with regard to questions around the education system, but before changing to it, I just would like to prove you right regarding the issue that you just mentioned with regard to Japan. We can see the same in Germany. When you look into anti-Semitic incidents, then you can see that, for example, anti-Semitism is very widespread in the eastern part of Germany, despite the fact that you have less than 0.1% of Jewish community over there. But the anti-Semitic and the narrative is much wider within the society, and you can see that extreme right-wing parties are having crazily high results in elections. But coming back to the issue of the education system, we had in the late 80s, University of Cologne, Professor Dr. Abdul Jawad Falatouri has made an analysis, a European comparative analysis about the presentation of Islam in Western textbooks. And it was a wide, huge study that has been made at that time. It took around 3 years. And it did not only refer to religious textbooks like Protestant or Catholic teaching materials, but also to books of geography, books of history. And it was quite a disastrous result that came out in the late 80s. But when we look into measures that are needed to change this globalization of Islamophobia that you are referring to, then I think the most important is to start with the textbooks and to start within the education system. So how is the situation in this regard in Europe?
Thank you. And I noticed one of our contributors, one of our viewers, has also raised a question. So thank you for that. In terms of the education system, I entirely agree with those who've commented and with your comments. There are significant steps that are being taken. So for example, the university which I worked, Montfort University, we have a project of decolonizing DMU. So it's about decolonizing the broader curriculum, but also decolonizing the institution. Ways in which I do that within my own lecturing and teaching, I seek to include scholars from marginalized backgrounds within Europe and within the West more broadly, but also scholars from the global South. And I think we have a great deal that we can learn from scholars in that regard. But also the material that we teach. So so I teach a module on global comparative politics, and part of what I teach there, I focus quite heavily on colonialism and decolonization in that regard. And a lot of my students would come up to me afterwards and say, you know, I'm from these countries, but I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. And the problem is that within the British education system, at least, colonialism does not feature on the national curriculum. And then we have the move towards academies that gives greater freedom for institutions, but also it results in the potential that these broader national concerns will not be heard by students. And I think that a lot of what we do, so anti-racism needs to be firmly embedded within our curricula. From the very earliest levels to higher education in universities, we need to teach history. A lot of it is rooted within history, but also championing voices today that come from those marginalized, discriminated backgrounds to foreground their experiences. And I try to take that approach within my own research. So I will engage in extensive field work, but it's not necessarily about my voice being heard, it's about the voice of Muslim women being heard. So I will use a lot of qualitative data. And in doing that, I can put out material that will be read by others that will hear these Muslim women's voices that are so sidetracked. And this material can be used in education. So I would agree completely that we need to overhaul our education system. That anti-racism and decoloniality need to be deeply embedded within our practices. And only then do we have a chance to raise an anti-racist, and I wouldn't even say tolerant, I don't think tolerance is the right word, but inclusive society where everybody has a space at the table, where everybody has a chance to be heard.
With maybe one before we go back to you, Ayub, you have mentioned the project of Professor Salib Al-Hassani and the golden age of Islamic history, if you put it like that. In how far Yani has this Islamic heritage went into British curriculums, or is there a mechanism that is now or could be followed in other countries where you see that a change in the curriculums is taking place? And in addition, after the curriculum, it is, as you just said, it is the teaching materials. But first of all, I think it is important that there is a common understanding that there needs to be a change with regard to the curriculum when it comes to history, geography, and even religious teaching.
So in terms of teaching Islamic heritage and history, unfortunately, it's not something that I've seen regularly, but my experience is not as a compulsory education teacher, more a higher education lecturer. But I think there are positive steps being taken by academics, being taken by nonprofit organizations who often struggle in terms of funding to deliver projects to schools that can be used. So, for example, there's the case of a director in Bradford, Connor Ibrahim, who produces films. He produced a film around Islamophobia called Fuisha. And the last I spoke to him, he intended to sort of divide the film up into smaller chunks that it could then be used in PSHE, so sort of personal social health education programs in the UK. But unfortunately, his work and the work of a lot of creative institutions relies on funding bodies, relies on charitable donations. And I think that particularly given the current climate that we're in with COVID, just in the UK, I think since March, there'd been a sort of increase of around 750,000 almost unemployed than we had previously. I think that unfortunately funding for these sorts of projects is going to be sidelined. And if we look at the Black Lives Matter movement or the Hijabis Fight Back movement in Belgium, it is the time that we need these sorts of endeavors to challenge the racial inequalities that are unfortunately so prevalent and being called out in our society.
Ayub.
Yeah, I would like now maybe to move on to, I know that you have done a lot of research about the political and other form of participations. So this is also a very interesting topic for me personally. Can you first, generally tell me what is your take on this issue about Muslim political participation in the European societies, especially if you take into account this huge rise of right-wing groups and nationalist parties that are, all around Europe, like Austria, Poland, and so on. And also after that, I know that you are even more focused on the Muslim women political participation. So can you tell us afterwards, this general observation of yours that you give us about the more details about Muslim women's participation in the sense where and how do they participate in the politics? What are the motivation to participate, the opportunities and the barriers? So, yeah.
Thank you for your question. So in terms of Muslim political participation, unfortunately, I think it's still quite low, given our comparable proportional constituency of the wider communities. I don't think it's something that should be viewed as exceptional. Rather, it should become the norm. Muslims are members of society, therefore Muslims should be involved in politics. Politics is the way of having your voice heard, having the voice of those like you heard, representing diverse communities as well as the community from which you come. So I think that Muslim participation should be entirely normalized. Unfortunately, there are definitely counter arguments around tokenism, around entryism. So the idea that Muslims just are there for the sake of it to make up diversity quotas, or the idea entryism that Muslims are there to take over. And it feeds back again into the Islamophobia stuff that we were talking about before. So I've looked at Muslim women's political participation in France and Belgium. In terms of my personal rationale for wanting to study this, and this constituted a lot of my PhD work, and it's now going to be a book published by Palgrave Macmillan as part of the New Directions in Islam series. The rationale I had for wanting to do this was, on the one hand, Muslim women are often their voices are often sidetracked. They're often marginalized in terms of the extent to which others hear their voices. Secondly, Muslims or Muslim women are typically viewed as these oppressed, subjugated individuals who are unable to participate. And thirdly, Muslim women are often targeted in terms of Islamophobic attacks. So there is something there that we need to shift, that we need to change. And my rationale was that if we highlight the amazing, the outstanding political work that's going on by Muslim women on the continent, we challenge the view that they're voiceless, that they're oppressed because they have active roles in society. We challenge the exclusion of their voices, but we also do something to begin to counter the dominant narratives of Islamophobia that sort of surround them. So in terms of my work on Muslim women's political participation in France and Belgium, I conducted a range of field work and interviews, qualitative interviews with Muslim women who are involved in politics. And I took politics to be quite a broad term. So I looked at women's engagement in international, supranational political organizations, national and regional politics, local council, but also things like more grassroots social activism, social movements, trade union activism, the sort of more soft politics, the less formally defined politics. And in the two cases, in France and Belgium, in terms of what motivated the women, I found that their motivations were diverse. And just like the rest of wider society, there were different things that pushed Muslim women to become involved in politics. It ranged from concern and care for the environment to very local issues around local education or the provision of local services, local traffic enforcement, for example. It was incredibly diverse. But behind that incredibly diverse set of motivations that pushed Muslim women into engagement, there was the underlining principle largely across the board that participation was a route to ensuring social justice. And it was something that mobilized their unique skill sets. And social justice and the betterment of the society where they lived, the community in which they found themselves, was something that stemmed from their Islamic beliefs and values. So here we have the allegation that Islam and Islamic values are entirely antithetical to European values. We have so-called European values that sort of cut across European and Islamic values, the idea of social justice. And it's this Islamic value combined with the European heritage that is pushing women to work to better the societies where they live. I don't think you can get any more embedded within a society than that. And I don't think you can get any more, it's a beautiful example of how women straddle these two worlds that they are part of. And that intersecting identity actually leads to the betterment of society. So the motivations were diverse, but also in part Islamically motivated. In France in particular, I found that those who express this Islamic basis of their ideals around social justice, they said they could never ever talk about it publicly. It would be like career suicide for them. So they had these beautiful values that could actually challenge the narratives around Muslimness, around their position as Muslim women actors in society, but ones that they were too scared to discuss in public because they knew they would be hounded. They would face a tidal wave of Islamophobic, racist discrimination. And I think of, for example, in 2010, there was the case of Ilham Moussaïd, I think her name was, and she stood with a far left party in Avignon, in the south of France. And she wore hijab. And the party was so marginal, it really shouldn't have mattered in a local election, but she faced that tidal wave of Islamophobic racist abuse. And not only did she get the direct targeting, the leader of the party was criticized, and he was told, why don't you do something about that representative of yours, that sort of election candidate of yours? So there was that infantilization that Muslim women aren't capable of dealing with the criticism. There was that infantilization. So there's the kind of thing that if you express your Muslimness in French politics, you will automatically be shot down. Ultimately, in both societies, France and in Belgium, I found that a lot of Muslim women came to the conclusion that that wasn't ideal, but it was better for them to have a seat at the table, to have their voices heard, to have the voices of their constituents heard within the political system, and to make some sort of difference, even if they were fighting these numerous barriers and difficulties. In terms of the opportunities you asked, Ayub, the opportunities again are very contextually driven. So in Belgium, where you have a much more proportionally representative system, where you have gender parity quotas, where you have some degree of vote seeking as well, Muslim women were likely to find themselves ticking numerous boxes and also securing a lot of votes, so that because of the D'Hondt calculation, they were likely to get a seat. In France, where you have that sort of more two-party system, women's representation tends to be incredibly poor. So when you add that further layer of Muslimness and often ethnic difference, they tended to be excluded from the more senior roles. So the opportunities are very much based on the political system. But I think vote seeking is definitely a key characteristic in terms of the likelihood of them being fielded in formal political roles. Coming on to barriers, unfortunately, the barriers were incredibly numerous. Women in general encounter barriers to political participation. And I think COVID and the working from home has showcased a lot of those gendered differences in society. Women are more likely to take on domestic responsibilities. They're more likely to take on childcare responsibilities. And I hear this from many colleagues, if there's an argument over who has a meeting and who uses the office, for example, it does tend to descend in all of that. So Muslim women, unfortunately, and a lot of us are career women, and we're active as both Muslims and in our careers, we tend to face that gendered barrier. And then with Muslim women, you have that layering, that intersectionality that brings the ethnic barriers in terms of the likelihood, if you're an ethnic minority Muslim, that a white voter might not vote for you because of your ethnic difference. And then I think the most stark and obvious one was around Islamophobia and Islamophobic discrimination. So you almost come full circle, that their presence can discriminate it, but you're fighting it against Islamophobia to even get in. And it almost becomes this sort of continuous cycle. But I discuss a lot of this in my book. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Amina, would you agree with me that one of the challenges that we see in this regard is that we look into it as if it is the responsibility of the women to join and to participate and to play a role and to raise their voices. Whereas if we look into the development of democracy in Europe in general, but especially also in Western Europe within the last 20 or 30 years, we can see that there is a tremendous threat that democracy is undergoing. And you can see the rise of the right-wing parties who very, very quickly gain huge votes by having the internet, by having new methods that you could use to mobilize for people. You can see that democracy is no more a given in many of the European countries. And I think it is very, very important that we encourage Democrats, men and women from all different layers, to understand that fighting for minority rights, encouraging minorities to join the political arena is so important for the societies in itself. I think on the one hand, we have to see that the fight is between an open society, on the one hand, democratic approach that we have lived through within the last 40, 50 years in most of the European countries, and especially after the unification of Europe, if we put it like that, having the Eastern countries joined, will have partly a more authoritarian understanding of a state that in the end is fighting minorities to a certain extent. So this continuous fight for democracy is so tremendously important, and it has to be understood as a common fight of all the people. It is nothing that is left to the minorities to fight for, whereas the minorities also should overcome the focus on their affairs and their issues, and to be mainly involved about issues that are related to them. I think they need to be much more obvious in their fight for betterment of society, for better housing, for better education, for better infrastructure, for better healthcare, for better food. Yeah. So in the end, all areas of life have to be targeted by minorities in a different manner. So do you agree that this is a responsibility of the wider society and not only of the minority?
I think absolutely it is the responsibility of all individuals within a society. We collectively make it what it is, and we can make it that positive space that accepts all sorts of diversity, that accepts difference, that celebrates diversity and difference. It's definitely the role of all individuals. In terms of Muslim communities, particularly those that I've worked with in Europe, I think they are doing those sorts of things. There are definitely Muslim-led food banks, for example, and I've seen that in Belgium, I've seen that in the UK, I've seen that in Germany, I've seen that far and wide. When I think of food banks, though, the bigger question I have to ask myself is, hold on, why are we in a state that claims to be developed, Western European, civilized, et cetera, and people need food banks? I think that there's the bigger issue of food poverty that, you know, we need to hold our leaders accountable for. But that's a side point. I think Muslims are doing that also in terms of the healthcare. So in the UK, the first, I believe it was about 5 doctors that they documented, the first to die as a result of COVID were Muslims. So Muslims play this integral role within the healthcare system. We are there. We might not be singing about it as Muslims, but we are there. We are there as members of society. I think that increased coherence would better our image, but at the same time, racism against Muslims or Islamophobia is structural. And until we deal with the structural issues, the institutionalized nature of Islamophobic racism, we will have a great deal of difficulty to tackle the everyday sort of ground level explicit attacks on Muslims. So if I take the example of Muslim women again, and the idea that states routinely pass legislation or routinely bring into political discourse questioning of the hijab, questioning of Muslim women's dress. So in France and Belgium back in 2015, there was scandal and intense fixation on Muslim women's long skirts. There is nothing religious about a long skirt. Any woman can wear one, but you had this idea that it was too Muslim, and you had this great intense political discourse condemning it, and the rejection or the banning of Muslim women for temporary periods of time from educational establishments. One, that limits Muslim women's ability to protect themselves into the future. It limits their educational development, but also that of their children, that of their families. So it's deeply problematic. But at the same time, those sorts of political debates, intense fixation that occurs, the media furor that occurs around it, sends a signal to the individual who has perhaps been manipulated by far-right politics, that has perhaps been falsely led by these sorts of populist views, that it is okay. Muslim women are so subhuman that we can pass laws against their very being So there is nothing wrong with me attacking that Muslim woman. There is nothing wrong with me pulling off her hijab. There is nothing wrong with me spitting at her, whatever it is that they do. And we see it time and time again, disgusting attacks against Muslim women. So what I mean here is that we need to tackle that legalization of Islamophobic discrimination. We need to tackle the historical roots that are often not dealt with in order to effectively tackle the more ground level, direct Islamophobic discrimination. So I think that it's at the same time, I think that our plan of countering all of this should be multi-layered. There should be people involved in legal campaigns, political involvement. There should be people supporting those who are victimized. There should be people who are challenging media. For example, people like Miqdad Bursi in the UK of MCB, who quite wonderfully and incredibly, there was a coverage in the Guardian about him, takes to task media institutions who publish Islamophobic headlines and publicizes them on his Twitter. We need to be doing that, but we need to be going at multiple levels. And the same can be said of other types of racist discrimination. Until we deal with the embedded structural nature of racism, we will have great difficulty in tackling the grassroots levels that continue to persist, unfortunately.
By the way, this is also one of the comments that we have just received from one of our, from the audience, who are saying that at present there are no costs on far-right groups, their leaders and followers, for propagating hate. So money trails should be exposed, United Nations should be pushed to sanction these individuals and organizations. I think it is also the role of the Muslim countries, maybe in this regard. But I believe what is important also to encourage minorities, and also especially the Muslim minority, to document the hate that they receive. So as long as you don't go to a police station, you don't take it to official channels, it is even not registered. And so it becomes afterwards that, well, we don't have a case. Yeah.
Absolutely. So in terms of part of what I wrote for the Counter-Islamophobia Kit project that's available for free to download on the website, that the approach that I take within my own work around Islamophobia, we need a sort of four-step approach. We need to define it. And if we look at the work of, for example, the British All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, they put together, consulting academics, a definition around what Islamophobia is. Numerous councils, although it's been rejected by government, numerous councils across the UK have in fact adopted it. So we recognize that it is a phenomenon. Two, I support the idea that we need to document Islamophobia. The European Islamophobia report that Ayub and I are both involved in forms part of this. But in terms of documenting at the same time, and I think the OSCE ODIHR have done a lot of work around this that is incredibly informative around anti-Muslim hate crimes and biases that exist. We must also recognize that, yes, it's important to document, but there exist those same sort of structural issues that I was discussing earlier. So you may be, and if we take the case of anti-Black racism, you may be reporting something, but if we look at the grotesque murder of George Floyd, there will still be reluctance potentially if we have this sort of embedded racisms that exist.
But I think we have to say that this is, the US is a different story. Yeah, and with all respect to, I think that we don't have in Europe these cases that could reach such an extreme form.
I think that Europe has its role to play. It has its role to play within the sort of colonization, the sort of settler colonization that's going on in places like America. It has its role to play in the slave trade that created all of these narratives. It has its role to play in colonialism that has massively impacted. So for example, in the UK, the sort of South Asian communities that are demonized as these post-colonial subjects. The same in France with the North African communities. I think at the same time, yes, what's going on in the US is abhorrent, but not for 1 second should we say that Europe isn't as bad. I think that there shouldn't be a hierarchy. I think that if there is racism, if there is discrimination, be it sexist discrimination or anti-minority group discrimination, we should call it out. So coming back to the sort of 4 steps I was talking about, so documenting, the 3rd and 4th step in terms of what I do, work in conjunction. So deconstruct the narratives around Islamophobia and replace them, reconstruct with more realistic portrayals of Muslimness. And I think that helps. So if we're doing all 4 of those steps in conjunction, we have a coherent picture. But that's not to say it's not without its own difficulties and issues that we might encounter along the way.
Anyhow, I just remembered also that we have in Germany the case of Uri Jallo, who has been burned in a police station 15 years ago, and the court case is not solved yet. It's not known what happened till today. So you're right. But still, I feel that there is a hierarchy, and the pictures that we see from the US are, well, I think it is a different society where everybody can run, carry weapons. This is, I think, an additional challenge that American people have to go through. Okay, so I think we are coming to the end, but I want to give Ayub also the chance to get his turn.
Jazakallah, Ibrahim. But I wanted to ask you first one question that you are also dealing a lot in your work. And afterwards, because last time in the first conversation series with Professor Haris Khalilovic, we got criticism that we didn't pose the questions from the Facebook that we got. So this time we will have also the questions or comments from our viewers. So before I go to the questions that we got, I just I would like to ask you about the gender dimensions of Islamophobia, because you mentioned this, especially the work that you done in Belgium is very interesting, especially in this moment when we have this headscarf ban in Belgium, in Brussels. And especially what was very interesting for me, your finding about the national gendered Islamophobic narratives related to demographic threat, women as a demographic threat. So it is very interesting to me that you, if you can give your reflection about it. And also the what we mentioned and what you are currently doing is this creative countering of Islamophobia, and this, let's say some kind of alternative ways and possibilities how we can counter the Islamophobia. So these 2 questions, if you can briefly, and then we can go to the Facebook questions and comments that we have.
Ayub, we have a total of 10 minutes, so Dr. Amina, you have to hurry a bit.
So around the demographic takeover and gender dimensions. So definitely Muslim women are seen simultaneously as oppressed, voiceless, and therefore we need these, allegedly, we need these legislative measures. It makes me think of the time I was in Sarajevo, actually, and there was, I think his name is Bernard Kouchner from France, and he was involved in the Stasi Commission 2003 that preceded the introduction of the Stasi law. And I asked him quite outright, why did you not include headscarf wearing Muslim girls that were going to be affected by your ban in your commission? Why did they not give evidence? And he said, well, we had people. We had Fadila Amara as the example. And often some of the things she said can be interpreted perhaps negatively towards Muslim women. And I think of something she wrote in her book. She wrote that Muslim women are seen as these sort of subdued and oppressed women. She also wrote something around Muslim women as these soldiers of green fascism. And what she meant by that was Muslim women are a threat. They pose a threat of alleged Islamism, and they're going to instill this in society. And I think of people like David Cameron, the former Prime Minister in the UK, who said things like Muslim women need to learn how to speak English so they can report their children if they suspect them of extremism. So it's almost like the responsibility comes to us, and that we are the conduits for, although we're oppressed, we're allegedly also the conduits for violent extremism to occur. So it's deeply problematic in many ways. So the burden falls on Muslim women from multiple angles. I think in terms of the demographic threat, also that I recall a front cover of Charlie Hebdo, the satirical comic magazine, and it had Muslim women. They were wearing headscarves and long dresses, and they were all pregnant. And they had a slogan at the top that it was all in caps: "Touchez pas nos allocs," don't touch our social security benefits. So there you're there scamming the state, but you're also producing more Muslims to take over French society. Well, I think Muslim women get it from multiple angles, and they face the very direct consequences in terms of physical attacks. Around your question of creatively countering Islamophobia. So this is some new work that I'm involved in. I'm currently conducting a pilot study in creatively countering Islamophobia through the use of festivals in UK cities. So I'm looking at Muslim-centered and Muslim-led festivals. Part of it, there are numerous forms of Muslim festivals, and we don't typically tend to think about them. Around celebrating Muslim art, Muslim culture, Muslim poetry, Muslim song, music, etc., that challenges a lot of the narratives. And these festivals tend to occur in sort of common spaces. So people who aren't typically from Muslim backgrounds will walk through, will encounter them. It shows a different side to Muslimness against that image of the barbarian Muslim male and the hyper-fertile, subdued Muslim female. It shows a different side, that there is a deep and rich culture, one that has contributed and continues to contribute to Western society. So I'm hoping to write that up in the forthcoming months, and we'll publish that work.
Okay, Joseph.
Okay, for the questions now, and maybe if you mention all the questions, and then we have one common answer.
Yeah, we have from Faraz Ghani that it is a very interesting, by the way, question, because
I have referred to Faraz Ghani's
no,
question.
the first question you didn't. We had two questions from the
oh, okay, sorry. Okay.
So he's asked about, and this is regarding my question about the difference in the Islamophobia, and this is very interesting observation of his. It seems, he says, it seems like many European countries, particularly southern and southeastern, see Islam and Muslims from a medieval lens. Their thinking has not moved over the centuries. It's similar to the evangelist view of Muslims in the US. What can we do to change this narrative? So this is the question from Faraz Ghani.
So thank you for your question, Faraz Ghani. In response to your question, I think you're entirely right that there are medievally informed views of Muslims within society. So I think of Spain, for example, where they have their quite not tactful and very insensitive festivals around Moros, for example, and people with blackface and dress up and go out in the streets, and it's informed by the conquest of, or the Muslim period of Spanish history, which is actually part of Spanish history. It's part and parcel of their own past. So it definitely does continue to inform their current views. But I think, and I hope that I've spoken to it a little, but in terms of countering Islamophobia, I think that those ideas of whereby we show, and I'm not sure if saying Muslim normalcy is the right way of going about it, because, or even our humanity, I don't think they're the right sort of terms, but our everyday nature, that our embeddedness in society, and to show our diverse individuality as Muslims. I think that that's part of the response. I think that there'll always be people that you can't convince who are so embedded in their Islamophobic views, but there will be a lot of people who've never heard of Muslims or heard directly from Muslims. And if they see Muslims in their everyday, or they see things that paint Muslims in a slightly different light, it may begin to counter the present Islamophobic views, but also those historically informed views that you're talking about.
Okay, we just have I think that we passed this. I now see that this another question, or like this is more a comment from MC Marshall. He's talking about the education system and needs a thorough and overhaul, and we need a much wider history curriculum. But I think that Ibrahim, you addressed already this about curriculum. So if you have to add, Dr. Amina, something, but I think that what is your? I think that we already answered this. But if you have to add something.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you ever so much for the comment, MC Marshall. I think that you're entirely right, that we do need to overhaul a lot of what we teach, and a wider history curriculum is one of the inlets into all of that. But also greater engagement of diverse players within our classrooms. I think that that's important, to include practitioners, to include everyday individuals as educators. I think that there's a lot we can learn from wider community. But decolonize the curriculum, that would be my key point, as much as you have scope to decolonize what you're teaching.
Yeah, okay. And the last, let's say, comment, it's more a comment, it's from Germana Schetta. Yeah, it's about state policies are best indicators of the place that is given or allowed to Muslims or anyone else for that matter. So I also think that we also touched upon a little bit about this role of state and the indicators and so on.
Absolutely. Thank you for your comment, Germana. I appreciate it. I think you're right that the policy gives clear insight into the way in which a country is going, but also it gives us potentially scope into how we might begin to challenge or where the starting point is in terms of righting some of the wrongs that are existing within a given society.
Okay, thanks. So I think, Ibrahim, that, and Dr. Amina, that we can conclude now that this is we passed through all the comments and questions. I'm more than grateful that you have been with us today, and I would really like to once more to emphasize and to call, or let's say to ask our viewers if they are interested in the work of Dr. Amina, that they can pre-order the book, which will be published in November 2020 by Palgrave Macmillan, Muslim Woman Political Representation in France and Belgium. And also you can see the book that Dr. Amina edited with Professor Salman Saeed and Ian Law about countering Islamophobia in Europe, which was published in 2019. So this is it. So I will now hand the word to Brother Ibrahim.
Yeah, thank you. Once again, thank you very much to all the, first of all, to Dr. Amina, to you, Ayub, for sharing this very interesting session, but also to all our viewers that have seen us live streaming. Who wants to get to know more about the European Muslim Network can visit our Facebook or our YouTube channel or our website. Thank you so much, and inshallah we will have the opportunity to see you all soon in another of the EMN series, inshallah. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you.